Hims House, Episode 7. I'm Jonathan Stern, and I'm here with Lewis Stevens and Dr. H. On today's episode, I want to discuss the broader telehealth industry. Let's start with market size. Now, market size is, of course, a rapidly changing phenomenon, given how nascent this market is and how fast the tech is evolving. Dr. H, to kick things off, what is your sense of the market size today, and how may it evolve in the coming years?
It's definitely an area that's growing and going to continue to grow. I think it's kind of like that train now that left the depot and it's picking up momentum and it's moving. And with pandemic being over, it kind of slowed down a little bit. But I think people got used to the idea of doing these virtual visits, having access to doctors at your fingertips. And I don't think they're going to let go of that, basically. I think it's just going to keep going and moving in that direction.
So, Dr. H, in the past, we've talked about the idea of certain ideas, certain business models have their time. You know, people were putting music on the internet in the 1990s. A lot of business models emerged in the 1990s as the internet matured, but many of them didn't become commercially viable for decades to come. Could you comment on the idea that it is digital healthcare's time? And why might it have struggled in past decades, in your view?
So in its infancy, telemedicine was pretty mundane. You know, not many providers or doctors' offices were offering it. It was disjointed. It wasn't easy for people to use. So with a lot of these companies now offering very easy to use interfaces, I think that's kind of catching up now, and it's allowing regular people to use the service where in the past it may have been limited to a very small amount of people because of lack of technology. So I think it's just waiting for the technology to catch up to what's being offered.
It brought to mind the conversation we had in the Discord today related to insurance. And correct me if I'm wrong, but HIMS does not accept insurance today. That's my understanding, right?
Yeah, to my knowledge, they're still not accepting insurance. And I can see why. The whole insurance industry is still so archaic. I know on some telehealth platforms, if, for example, Ro or Nurex in the past, or currently, they're still offering insurance coverage, I think. And to actually have someone's medicine or service covered by the insurance, they have to manually scan their insurance card, and then a staff member has to fill out the information manually. And there's a whole team of administrative staff that will have to manage all the communications with the insurance company if there's medication rejections or prior authorization requests. So it's just a very archaic system that has to be worked with when you're trying to accept insurance. So I can see why HIMS is trying to avoid that for now, because it would just add several layers of complexity and several extra steps in between patient intake versus when they get their actual treatment of medicine.
I mention that because I experimented with Teladoc personally, like in my own life, prior to experimenting with HEMS. And of course, Teladoc, the business models are radically different. But I bring it up just because that experience was so poor. And I was so turned off by the experience. I felt that it was complex. I didn't feel that it was straightforward. You know, the integration of insurance felt a little clunky. The experience just didn't make me want to use it again. So I was thinking the shifting model there could be a reason why we finally have a real profitable digital healthcare platform that's emerged in Hims and Hers Health.
Which part of it was the most difficult for you to use as a consumer?
I just remember the experience not being very seamless. And ultimately, I just felt that going to urgent care was the better experience. The insurance element adds a layer of complexity that creates friction. And then going to a pharmacy,
especially once a patient or consumer has experienced the streamlined process of an alternative form, such as HIMS, where everything's integrated, going to a different system where there's multiple steps in between, you're trying to do insurance coverage, and you're dealing with the frustrations of having to wait because your medicine's not accepted by the insurance. I think it just ends up causing the patient to be like, what the heck is this? You know, how come the other platform was so much easier?
I'm looking at the original Hims and Hers investor presentation. Essentially, these are the reasons Hims exists. These are the problems that Hims product solves. And I think one of the more interesting ones out of the lot is the idea that millennials would rather search for medical advice online versus seeing doctors in person. I think the question that has to be asked is, why has Hims emerged, right? And that's what this discussion has been about so far on today's episode. Why has this business model emerged today? And I think one compelling answer is the idea that, the world was sort of ready for it in terms of expectations. The primary demographic, i.e. millennials, have a certain expectation about how the world works, and Hims is catering to that expectation. In terms of TAM, I think the TAM was the genesis of this discussion. And we talked about it in the Discord today, Dr. H. The TAM and the intersection of total addressable market and insurance versus no insurance and Roe and Hims. Could you share your thoughts on how insurance fits into the total addressable market or the runway for growth? Why has Roe decided to start accepting insurance? Why has Hims decided not to accept insurance? And I think the last data point that I would include in my question is Roe has been losing market share to Hims. So does that play a role, or what's your take on all of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure when Roe started accepting insurance. I'm not sure if they started accepting it right from the get-go or just recently added it. If I'm speculating, and if they started accepting it recently, it may be as a way to compensate for losing market share to Hims. They may be thinking, hey, we're starting to fall behind here. Let's just try to start accepting insurance to see if we can bring in more clients and more patients. That's possible. I feel like with people, generally, someone would ask to use insurance if they think they can get a treatment covered for a cheaper price than what a cash price would be. And when you're dealing with medicines like, for example, finasteride, you could theoretically get finasteride covered by insurance, and it could possibly be dirt cheap, cheaper than a custom formulation that Hims may offer. And that may be the motivation for someone to really try to get medicines covered, is they think they can get their insurance to pay for something and get it cheaper. The issue with insurance then is generally they're not going to cover compounds or special formulations. If they cover medicines, it's usually generics, a very basic form of a medicine that's available. So I'm guessing that's why patients might want to ask and have insurance covered. On the opposite side for Hims, I'm just guessing they've seen their business model take off without accepting insurance. They've seen businesses like Teladoc who have a different business model, but they're working with insurance companies and they're struggling to make money. And if they see how well they're doing without it, they may be thinking, why are we even going to offer this option? Let's stick with these custom formulations that people want, that insurance isn't going to cover anyways, and let's keep rolling with what's working. Why mess with something that's working?
Yeah, really interesting thoughts, and specifically around the custom formulation. So Johnny and I were talking earlier about the topic for today's podcast, and the idea was that we were going to discuss Hims' total addressable market.
I would love to get to the TAM at some point. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that Dr. H provided a great segue into discussing the TAM. There's a few different interesting ways to look at a company's TAM, especially a younger growth company's TAM. Number one, oftentimes analysts and investors underestimate a TAM. I think in the case of, for instance, Google, the TAM was vastly underestimated. There was an infamous, at this point, bearish perspective from the 2000s that said that Google would never be able to grow into its $20 or $30 billion market cap. And obviously that individual was vastly underestimating the TAM that lay in front of Google in the early 2000s. Conversely, eBay, during the dot-com bubble, many people thought that eBay's TAM was effectively infinite, and it proved to be very small, relatively speaking, especially to Amazon, relative to Amazon's third-party marketplace TAM. eBay's TAM is negligible. And we kind of saw a 2.0 of that with Etsy over the last 5 years. So with that in mind, Dr. H, I'd like to hear your perspective. But the last thing I wanted to mention related to your compounded formulation comment is the idea that oftentimes during technological revolutions, formerly small TAMs actually grow by virtue of the advent of a certain technology. I think it could be argued that finasteride's TAM has been 2 billion or whatever. But with the new format for delivery, digital healthcare, that TAM becomes potentially 5 billion. And then if you create a compounding formulation combining minoxidil, finasteride, biotin, and vitamin C into one tablet that's really convenient, maybe the TAM grows incrementally more, and the company supplying that does have a material competitive advantage.
I feel like it could be only limited by how much money they can spend to get their name out to let people know of what the products they're offering. And as they incorporate new products, new treatments, obviously your market and your TAM increases with each new service they provide. And medically speaking, you just look at United States. How many people are in the United States? What's your population? What's your ability to reach out to get these people to understand your offering?
Yeah, and I think that's especially true for weight loss.
Each time you bring in a desirable treatment for a condition that's common, you just open so many doors to revenue and subscribers and things like that. Hims is dropping nuggets of info on their website about testosterone, and that seems like it's in the presentation. That's probably one of the treatments coming soon. What's the market for that? Well, basically any male in the United States age 35 and up is a potential customer, and that's a large number of people who would look into your services, and you just have to reach out to them and get their attention, basically.
I want to move to comparing Hims with some direct competitors. Dr. H, I know you were looking into various pricing comparisons with Roe, with some of 30 Madison's subsidiaries, Blue Chew. Do we have any info on how fast these startups are growing? How does Hims compare in terms of pricing?
For the vast majority of these telemedicine platforms, if you're offering a relatively comparable product or treatment, the price range is not drastically different. So Hims is not going to be drastically cheaper or much more expensive than a Roe that offers ED treatment. They're all going to be in the same ballpark. Sometimes they may even share similar sources too, especially if you're looking at small telemed companies. They may have the same pharmacies as other small telemed companies. So the actual product price, probably not much different. Sometimes Hims might be a little bit more expensive. Sometimes it might be a little bit cheaper. It probably averages out to be pretty comparable for pricing of treatments.
I guess any specifics where Hims has the advantage or is maybe a little behind?
Are you referring to actual cost of medicines then, or treatments for the patient?
Pricing of the medicines for the patients.
Yeah, GLP-1s, it's pretty equal across the board. $199 a month for semaglutide. That's pretty average pricing across the board. ED medications, the Hims, basic generic Viagra and Cialis type medicines, I think is probably going to be a little bit more expensive just for the generic medicines compared to other platforms. But once you start talking about the compounded mints and chews, then it kind of equalizes out to be a similar price. So it was always interesting to me that the Hims generics sometimes are a bit more expensive than where you could find elsewhere. And it may be by design. They may be trying to say, hey, we'll offer it to you and it will still work, but we really want to try to steer you into these areas of our custom formulations, and that's unique to us.
Question about industry dynamics. Do we expect this to be an industry like cereal, with dozens, maybe hundreds of companies battling it out? Or is it more likely to consolidate to a couple big players? I mean, right now we're probably at 4, 5, 6 notables in the telehealth industry. Do we expect that number to explode or compress over time?
Yeah, Johnny, I love this question. If you could pull up the image that I sent you just while I talk, I think it would really benefit the viewers. It's a really fascinating question. Number one, the market is fragmented, and it always will be fragmented. It always has been fragmented because the market is the primary care physician market, where traditionally folks have gone to get ED meds, get help with their hair, get help with testosterone. Low T is a huge thing. Service at least thousands of different clinics throughout the United States. Mental health has traditionally been a primary care / psychiatric endeavor. And this has just been a massive fragmented market for decades now. And so there have been many businesses operating profitably, selling what amounts to commodity drugs. So there's been this massive fragmented market with every player operating profitably and with every player essentially providing the same medical care. So I just think using that framework is interesting. Another framework would be the idea that compelling investments are often found in highly fragmented industries, highly fragmented, highly competed industries where the net promoter score might be a little bit lower or very low, and a company enters the market, creates a vertically integrated offering, creates a differentiated user experience, and correspondingly, there are differentiated economics. And we discussed the Uber example in the past. It came into a highly fragmented, highly competed market, vertically integrated the point solutions associated with the product that was the traditional ride-hail taxi experience. That created different economics, created different experience, and it created this massive business. And so that's the second framework that I think is worth considering as it relates to Hims, because whatever your belief is about the business, it has vertically integrated point solutions for the traditional medical industry. We've gone through that already on a past episode. All of that's happening. That's the second framework. And then the last thing I would say is, coincidentally, when you asked me that question, I was looking at the Spruce Point Capital Management. This is a firm that specializes in shorting companies. And you can go to their website and you can read their short report on Hims and Hers Health. You just type in Spruce Point Capital Hims and Hers Health into Google, and I believe it's the first link, and you can read it for free. But I was looking at this short report, and what I found interesting was that they tried to highlight this wildly competitive landscape. But if you look at the players in the landscape, Spruce, with all due respect to Spruce, is doing their absolute best to convey the idea that this is a very crowded space. Spruce, if you read the rest of the short report, you will see what I mean. It's a full-on attack. They are, as comprehensively as they humanly can, painting Hims in a negative light. I'm not criticizing Spruce here. I'm just trying to contextualize what we're looking at together on the screen right now. So this is their absolute best attempt at conveying to us the idea that Hims operates in a very competitive industry. Now, with that in mind, if you look at the players in the industry, let's talk about them, starting with Talkspace. Talkspace, ticker symbol TALK, is down like 98%. Teladoc, which owns BetterHelp, is in disrepair. I mean, the stock's down 95%. It's totally imploded. It bought Livongo. It engaged in one of the greatest capital destruction events in the history of American capitalism in 2021 by buying Livongo at $18 billion, virtually all of which, I think all of which, it just had to write down. And then, ThriveWorks, Brightside Health. What are these brands?
I'm very involved in the telemedicine space, and there are these names here I've never even heard of. I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they have patients, a small number of patients, but are they a threat to a bigger company like Hims? I don't think so. Like, what's Synergy Therapy? Is that like a local place out of Florida? I don't know. Just like, jump in here. I had
maybe they're not a threat, but this is an awfully fragmented looking market map. I mean, to Lewis's point, some of these companies are left for dead or just extremely small. Certainly, not the first thing on Hims's mind. But what are we to make of the industry dynamics? How might they evolve? Help us think through some of that, Dr. H.
Can we just mention that these companies are all dead? 23andMe is dead.
Oh, yeah. Their whole board quit, didn't they?
It was like sold to China or something.
23andMe is potentially preparing for a sale. Yeah. publicly listed company, but they are, that's the definition of left for dead.
They included Mark Cuban.
Cost Plus is a legitimate business, right?
It is, but it's not a Hims competitor. It's
It's not
basically
a
a pharmacy. It's a
Yeah.
pharmacy that you can access online. It does not
Right.
provide medical services, it does not provide novel treatments that are custom formulated. It's basically an online pharmacy. It's much different from Hims.
I don't even see, what is it, Nurx or Blue Chew or a few other actual competitors. I do, and yeah, we have a list of some companies that are just about dead. I don't know. This was what, a year plus ago?
And we can touch on the fact that Roman tried to field Rory and failed in doing so. I think Happy Head, what was the company, Dr. H, that was shut down for, oh, that was Cerebral. Did they include Cerebral? Didn't Cerebral get shut down for selling?
Yeah, and the CEO or whoever the founder was federally indicted.
Was that Cerebral or was that done?
That was get done. But I think Cerebral is also closely being monitored, I think.
My candid take is that this is not a competitive landscape. Just objectively speaking, I don't want to create negative karma for us, but this is a disaster. The stock prices of half these companies have imploded. This is Bosley is like men in their 60s are using Bosley. It's just this ridiculously outdated brand. It's just it's the whole thing's a disaster.
Lewis, I want to press you on this a little bit. So if we were to look like 3 or 5 years ahead and create the best version of this market map, would it have 3 companies or will it have 30?
I think it comes back to what I was saying with the fragmented market is I think other players can coexist. There's just not strong competition in any remote sense. And the primary evidence of that is that Roman is the best company here. On this slide, Roman is the best one in terms of execution of a digital healthcare brand. And it has struggled against Hims. I'm sorry to cut you off earlier, Dr. H, but I just wanted us to emphasize that this is crazy.
I had some thoughts. Can I chime in?
Yes, Dr. H.
Yeah, I actually was having this discussion with one of the Discord members. And I personally thought people talking about moat this and moat that, what's Hims and moat, can't any company just jump in? I feel like in this telehealth, telemedicine space, it doesn't necessarily have to be winner take all. I feel like the winner probably would take most. I know we're trying not to compare it to insurance companies, but if you look at health insurance companies, the 5 biggest health insurance companies in the United States, United Healthcare Group, Anthem, Kaiser Permanente, Humana, those 4 or 5 companies make up over half of the health insurance market in the United States. And then you have a bunch of small companies. Are the small companies going to exist? Yeah. Are they a threat to United or Anthem? No. How much bigger is United compared to Anthem? It's quite a bit bigger. So I feel like in this health space, you can coexist to a point, but I think the winner will probably take a big lion's share of the winnings. There's always going to be people nipping at your ankles trying to take a share, but if you execute, which I think Hims probably will, I think that there's going to be a winner that is doing much, much better than the rest.
Let's close this discussion with some thoughts about the regulatory environment, particularly as it relates to GLP-1s. I think it was yesterday or the day before that we had the compounding organization suing the FDA for lifting the shortage of tirzepatide. I just want to understand what it's like for Hims to operate in this industry from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. From a regulation standpoint, there's state level and federal regulations that any telemedicine company will have to kind of comply by. Certain things like state level regulations for what services can be done over the internet versus what medicines can be done. Certain states may have more strict rules. California, some of the states in the South. It's the same thing with healthcare in general. It's fragmented. So each state will have their own specific rules. So a company like Hims will have a team of attorneys to look at each state level law and see if they can practice medicine and offer a certain medicine within that state. So some states may have certain medicines that are controlled substances, and they may say, we can't do this medicine in the state, but in this other state, you can. So it is also fragmented, just like the rest of the healthcare, where you really got to look at what can be offered in certain states. So that's why companies will have maps even of what treatment is offered, what services are offered in which states. From a federal level, there is some reach, and we saw during COVID from a federal level, there was the ease of restrictions where physicians could provide care to outside of their state during the pandemic. And that was something that was helpful because there's a pandemic and we're increasing the access to care during this time of need. So federal laws can affect this. We're seeing some discussion about, you mentioned the GLP-1s and the FDA reach and influence on whether compound pharmacies can sell this and make this medicine. We're seeing discussion about whether certain things like the Chevron doctrine decision with the Supreme Court, is that going to allow decisions about this type of thing be pushed towards the court systems? So I think there is going to be things that need to be looked at from both a state and a federal level.
Do we have any idea if Hims has a specific lobbyist presence in DC, or do we think they rely on other organizations like the compounding organization that recently sued the FDA to handle those sorts of things?
As a complement to Johnny's question, realtors have an organization that lobbies in Washington. Do digital healthcare providers, or is there anything like that for your ilk, so to speak, physicians working online primarily like you?
There is an association called the American Telemedicine Association. I don't know if they're all that powerful. I don't know if they have much lobbying power, but I think the physicians, at least from the physician standpoint, there's a group where they have created to try to reach out to legislative and lawmakers and things like that to help with, telemedicine and the whole telehealth world. But Jonathan, I'm not sure how much influence they have, how much they can drive the discussion from a legislative level.
I want to briefly discuss Amazon, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens. Inevitably, if Hims works, if Hims goes from 3 billion to 6 billion to 20 billion in market cap, it will make the larger companies even more interested in the space. Inevitably, the TAM will have grown. The behemoths' antennae will be up. Louis, what is the best argument for how they might leverage their massive distribution networks to pose a threat to Hims? Should we expect that they'll continue to try to roll out their own offerings, or do you think they'd try to partner with Hims?
So Amazon just partnered with Talkspace, which is one of the alleged competitors to Hims, whose stock is down just catastrophic amounts, and who was having trouble staffing its platform, which is an indication of just how difficult the business model is to execute for just mental health alone, which, Talkspace is all about discussing your psychiatric needs. And that alone was challenging for them to execute. And now Amazon is partnering with them. To answer your question, we're going to have to do a whole episode on this topic because it is the primary, it's the primary bear thesis. And I read somewhere, they asked, why wouldn't Amazon just crush Hims like it crushed Teladoc? And to be clear, Amazon did not crush Teladoc. We've discussed it on this podcast. Teladoc allocated $18 billion of cash and equity value to an acquisition that it had to write down to the tune of $18 billion. One of the grandest destructions of shareholder value in the history of American capitalism. So there's been no grand victories. There's been no major victories for the incumbent players here that have control of distribution. I'll say in short, number one, there haven't been any grand victories. Number two, it's scary. Amazon has 180 million Prime members. Why can't it just start shoving nearly free prescriptions, nearly free medical visits? It's worth asking. And that question has been asked for many defining businesses over the last 30 years, such as Intuitive versus Microsoft in the 90s, Google again versus Microsoft in the 2000s, Google versus Apple, Spotify versus Apple. When you open your iPhone, why can't Apple just send you a little message that says subscribe for 6 months for free to Apple Music? It's a totally commodity product. Why couldn't they? And the list goes on and on of this distribution control, because distribution control is very powerful. And Microsoft has created a multi-billion-dollar cloud business, 80% gross margins, 40% free cash flow margins, a multi-billion-dollar cloud security business, which is a nascent and burgeoning industry on which CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and Palo Alto Networks and Microsoft are capitalizing. But it has built a multi-billion-dollar cloud business in the span of 3 years. It's going to take SentinelOne or CrowdStrike a decade to get to that scale. So how did Microsoft do that? It's because it has, I don't know how many cybersecurity clients it has, but let's say it has 5 million that it's gathered over the last 30 years. It can just instantly put in front of them a new product, and they'll adopt it because it'll be so cheap and it will work well enough. So I think that'll be our cliffhanger. How can Hims combat this really powerful advantage that incumbents have?
Good first pass at that answer, but it does sound like we have some meat left to eat on the bone for future episodes. This has been Hims House episode 7. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.